Do it on the, not on the cloud.
Not on the cloud. Now, recording in progress now. So let me introduce Madina. Very briefly, what Madina sent. Otherwise, I can tell a few lines about Madina. That is, she is between two worlds. When she was elsewhere, Soviet Union collapsed and Russia was born. So that time, the most important thing happened is that she was stateless. And those who haven't been stateless cannot imagine what statelessness is. So that experience is something I really read, and I had chill in my bones, so to speak, that what would have happened, because ours is a very good chance. India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, who gets stateless when knows. So that's one experience. I leave it to Madina, and what Madina sent to me, very few lines. I read that few lines to you. Professor Madina Tlostanova is a feminist thinker and fiction writer, professional of postcolonial feminisms at Linköping University, Sweden. Her research interests include decoloniality, the post-socialist human condition, fiction and art, critical future inquiries, and critical interventions into complexity, crisis, and change. Tolostanova's most recent books include A New Political Imagination, Making the Case, co-authored with Tony Fry, Routledge 2020, Decoloniality of Knowledge, Being and Sensing Center of Contemporary Culture in Kazakhstan 2020, Kazakhstan translation also 2023, and Narratives of Unsettlement, Being Out of Joint as a Generative Human Condition, Routledge 2023. Currently, she is working on a book entitled Stateless Future. And today, our title of the talk, what Madina has given, is Decoloniality Revisited, What Still Makes Sense and What Needs to be Rethought. This is a very brief introduction. He has written with Walter Mignolo also. So, I mean, what I said is probably, 1 out of 100. This is 1% of Madina. Otherwise, Madina is like, what I like other part is most, she's a scholar activist. She's just not an ivory tower theorist. Madina, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Diabara, for this wonderful introduction. And can I maybe share my screen?
Sure, go ahead.
Is it possible?
Yeah,
yes.
The green button at the
yes.
share the screen.
Right. Share.
Keep your PPT.
Can you,
yeah, share the screen.
Can you see this? Yes. Okay. So I'm really honored. Thank you, Bua, for this introduction, because I always prefer to speak outside of Europe, because we share more with people from other local histories that have colonial histories, that have this colonial element and the long post-colonial and anti-colonial and maybe decolonial also in some ways. And in that sense, I was just telling before we started, like, for example, I really loved my trip, my visit to India several years ago, because I learned so much in those 2-3 weeks that I spent in India. I was meeting with all sorts of different faculties and students. And what amazes me in such places that are from periphery or semi-periphery or the global south is how more knowledgeable people are, because we're all obliged to know the Western knowledge, so to say, because you cannot survive without it. But at the same time, there was so much more that my interlocutors in India knew about and could share their knowledge about the local theorists and the local activism, and that was really amazing. And this is something that I really miss in Europe, and especially in this part of Europe very often. But today I wanted to talk also about decoloniality, if we look at it like several decades after it was launched, because I think it's really important to kind of reflect critically on what happened to it and why there are some blind spots there and why it's not able to always maybe react adequately to what's happening in the world today. But at the same time, I don't want to throw away decoloniality, because I think there are so many important insights that were formulated by Aníbal Quijano, by Maria Lugones, if we speak about feminism, and of course by Walter Mignolo as well. And even if I disagree with them in some points, and I will try to explain maybe later if I have time why, but I think it's important to acknowledge that there are certain things within decolonial thinking that really went deep to question modernity, coloniality, as we call it there, right? Modernity / coloniality. And these things have to do with knowledge production, with epistemologies, with the way we look at the world, with the way we interpret the world, with the way we relate to the world, to other people, to other species. So that is something that is still very valuable for me. So before we go into this discussion of what's happening today, we should probably very briefly look at how decoloniality emerged. What were the historical, geopolitical, and theoretical contexts in which it emerged? I think it's very important because coloniality of power, and here on the screen you see the definition that was given by Aníbal Quijano, Peruvian sociologist, who was one of the first who formulated, maybe the first, who is associated with the decolonial option the way we know it today. So this is his definition, that coloniality is conceived together with America and Western Europe and with the social category of race as the key element of the social classification of colonized and colonizers. So this is like the basic definition from which we go, and then we can also define coloniality of knowledge, coloniality of being, like our existential element, right? And the coloniality of gender, coloniality of sensing, and many other things. But at the same time, when was it written? This was written in the early 90s. And his works in Spanish were written a little bit before the ones that were really first, and not even all of them translated into English by now. So it's like the end of the 80s, the early 90s. What is this period? It's a period when the Soviet Union collapses, when the state socialist system, the so-called Second World, in the old definition of the Cold War, collapses. And when a very complex kind of sensibility comes into the picture. What is this sensibility of the global left? The sensibility is that it's not possible to have a decolonized, democratized world because nothing works. Instead of decolonization, we have neocolonialism everywhere. We have these long traces of colonialism, and that's how this definition of coloniality, colonialidad in Spanish, comes into picture. It's not about a specific kind of colonialism or imperialism, but it's this trace that is left when you gained independence, but you still are very much dependent on the frames of thinking that were imposed by colonialism. And also,
Madina, just let me interrupt you for 1 minute. I see Professor Alatas joining. Professor Alatas, you are here, sir?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes.
Hi.
Okay, thank you very much for joining. Okay,
Thank you,
Madina.
thank you,
Go
thank you
on.
so much. Hi.
Okay.
Hi. So can we continue now?
Other. Yeah, what?
All right.
You
Okay,
are
so
on
where
the
did
same team, my team.
So where did I stop? Oh, I stopped with this
I'm
crisis of the early 90s, when decoloniality comes into the picture, when Soviet Union collapses, and when the global left are very kind of depressed because of this last chance of, believing, let's say, into this global meta-narrative of socialism and whatever. So all of that at that point collapses, and it becomes clear that it's not possible to kind of expect this to come in the near future, so it remains a dream. And that's why I think in one of the recent decolonial texts, you see this bitter kind of reflection on the past and saying, we realize that the state cannot be democratized and the state cannot be decolonized. So it's out of this, and in some kind of subconscious way, maybe, that the decolonialidad comes as I say, okay, let's not concentrate on real political struggles for independence, let's say, or for any kind of cultural rights, but let's concentrate first at this point when we are really at this low point, historical point of our struggles. Let's concentrate on working with our minds, with working of how we can decolonize people's thinking first. And then it's a very slow process, of course, and then that would require some extra effort. And that's basically what you see in this early decolonial texts. And this is for what we are usually criticized very harshly by Marxists, for instance, who say, why don't you deal with economic models? Why don't you talk about the revolution? Yeah, but instead of that, it's like, okay, let's see how we frame the world. What is our model of worlding? How do we connect and relate to other beings, other humans, and whatever? And actually, I think that it's much more difficult than building some kind of new grand narrative. And that's how it emerges, and that's how you see these other definitions that come later, that coloniality is a special kind of imperial colonial relations that emerged in the Atlantic world in the 16th century and brings imperialism and capitalism together, launching modernity as this overarching global project. And then a few years later, there comes decoloniality, because first decoloniality did not exist as a separate category, but I think about 10 years into decolonial option, it starts to emerge more in the texts of the main people who write in this paradigm. So there's a decoloniality arrives at this uneasy moment of the state socialist system collapse and discrediting of this social utopia, the last grand social utopia of the 20th century. And at that point, of course, you remember very well that it was the arrival of neoliberalism unchecked, and this sort of people like Fukuyama who were writing about the end of history narrative, and of course, very celebratory understanding of globalization, which is over now. But at that point, of course, switching to the areas of epistemology and maybe to some extent ontology, onto epistemology and aesthetics was a way to still, have these decolonial radical ideas, but have them only in smaller areas, nodes, cracks, as Catherine Walsh would call it. She calls it decolonial cracks. I like the concept very much. So that's how it emerges. And another thing is that, of course, to me, at least, I'm giving you my perspective on this. To me, decolonial thinking, the way we know it now, coming from Latin America first, right, and then being remodeled and rethought in other regions of the world, could not emerge in the previous anti-colonial era and Cold War era. It's a product of this grim context of partial defeat and realization of impossibility to implement anytime soon the ideals of equality, of social justice, or to decolonize or democratize politics. So in that sense, it's connected with this disillusionment. And another thing, if we go to a different level, let's say, the conceptual level, decoloniality also could not possibly emerge before the post-constructivist turn in social thinking, so in social sciences and also in the humanities, because it is grounded in discarding any universalist ideals, these grand utopias, and homogenizing master narratives. And that's one of the reasons why, for example, Marxists, like a true Marxist core, they can never understand what we are trying to do, because there is this deeper conceptual and methodological difference, I guess. So epistemically, this places decoloniality into a different space as opposed to Marxist and anti-colonial critique of the earlier times. And decoloniality is an open process in that sense. And it's not somehow attainable or even definable as a result. There is no result. It's always open-ended. And that's another thing that's very hard to explain to people, because our minds, and including just popular conceptions and also academic conceptions, they like this sort of happy end narratives, you know, like, okay, so now we take our discipline, we decolonize it, and then we have a perfect decolonized area studies, for instance, or sociology. It doesn't work that way. You cannot decolonize anything once and forever. It's a process. It requires constant work, and you have to be very critical of what you yourself are doing. And of course, also, you have to be, I think we have to be attentive to what's going on in the world. So one of the issues I find with decoloniality today, and why I really think it's stuck in some ways, important ways, is that it still repeats certain concepts and certain ideas that were formulated then in the early 90s. And of course, the gap with the current world is growing every minute. And as a result, there are some problematic statements and problematic texts that were published by preeminent decolonial scholars in the last, let's say, 5 years. And if we have time, I can talk about that also later a little bit. Yeah, so here we come to knowledge production because it's in the center of Bulasphere, a series of lectures here. So decoloniality does indeed question the very modern colonial mechanisms of knowledge production and distribution, rather than just describing or condemning different historical versions of colonialism, racism, classism, or attempting to formulate some the universal big theory for these multiple and diverse cases. And for me, this is an important difference that academically you can see very clearly in many texts that some of them are still within this modern colonial sort of detached, alienated kind of writing that pretends to be objective and that mainly describes things. And there are great works there. I mean, it's important to have those kind of writings as well. But to me, the problem with them is that they don't do anything. They describe the situation, like, for example, feminist texts about intersectionality. Yeah, they describe also all those intersecting discriminations, but then what? They don't offer anything else. There are no additional steps there. While decolonial option, at least in the beginning, promises to not do that, to just radically delink, as Walter Mignola would say, from all of these modern colonial frameworks. Another question is, for me at least, okay, they promised that, but did they ever deliver that? Was it really possible for decolonial so-called theorists really radically delink from Western or Euro-modern ways of thinking? I don't think so. And if we take any of the decolonial texts, we see that they're very much still ingrained in those traditions from where these authors come. You know, and it shows on many different levels. I mean, traditions of general Eurocentric thinking, but I also mean the way the texts are structured, because it's still text written and published in, peer-reviewed journals. So they have to follow certain very logocentric rules and ways. In that sense, it reminds me of the story that I'm sure you know about Homi Bhabha fighting a lot in the beginning of his career because he wrote in such a weird way that nobody wanted to publish his texts in the West. And it was very difficult at first to publish him, precisely because he was not writing in that linear, logical, modern/colonial way that you have to write in. So that's one of the things. Like, if you still want to be part of academia, you cannot radically delink. And that's why, for instance, I hate writing academic texts. And at this point, most of the time I refuse from these collections and all sorts of articles. I don't see the point. I mean, I'm old enough. I want to kind of spend the rest of my life doing what I like to do and writing fiction or writing some experimental decolonial texts rather than another article that nobody's going to read anyway. And it's not going to change anything in the world. So in that sense, I think that there was a lot of promise. But also, I mean, of course, decolonial thinkers are mostly very critical towards disciplines, which I totally agree with. I hate these disciplinary divisions, and I love, in that sense, the book that was written by Lewis Gordon, I think in 2006, which is called Disciplinary Decadence, where he explains that there are so many more and more disciplines that are being created and launched, and people are just defending their discipline. They don't have any project behind it, which I see a lot. And also when they try to decolonize disciplines, which is another funny game. It's like recently there was an anecdotal case when somebody invited me to give a keynote and they said, can you come and give a talk on decolonizing development? And I said, no, because development is a deeply colonial thing. You know, the whole paradigm is completely colonial. So it's like decolonizing slavery. You can't do that. And that also shows how decolonization today is misused. And that's another thing we probably have to reflect on. Like, first of all, it's appropriated by all sorts of mainstream and status quo groups, let's say, who just want to mainstream it a little bit, you know, and I say, okay, let's add this decolonial twist to whatever we're doing and do the tick boxing, and then we will be so modern and contemporary and hip. And that's what I see a lot of that in Europe all the time, everywhere. On the other hand, is a more dangerous thing when the right, alt-right political forces are appropriating decoloniality for its use. And you can see this in Russia, for instance, when Putin appropriates some decolonial ideas. You can see it in Europe or in other countries in Europe with this kind of conservative views. You can see it in India, I think, as well. There are cases of that. But I think, again, here, decolonial thinkers are not careful enough to not kind of ignore this. They have to talk about this. They have to explain what's the difference between them and the alt-right or the alt-nationalists or whatever, but they don't care. I know that Walter Mignola is now writing a book in which he wants to address this and explain, probably, hopefully, what is the difference of his views and those of conservatives in Russia and in France, I think, and in India. But so far, there are not many texts on that. I mean, there are some sentences here and there, but it's certainly not enough, because then, as a result, the whole decolonial option is disqualified more and more and seen as this dangerous conservative pro-Putin gang that is really becoming neocolonialists themselves, or neo-imperialists rather in this case. So it's very interesting how it's appropriated from outright. Yeah, and of course then it's also despised by the global left because automatically decolonial thinking is associated with nationalism, and that is a bad thing, a taboo for many leftists. I see a lot of these struggles, a lot of these fights in Europe, because, you know, Europe is one of those places to which these new ideas come very late. So they just discovered decoloniality 2 years ago, and all of a sudden it's now a bad thing for them because of the war, of the Russian invasion in Ukraine. So a lot of people are confused because of that. And what I have to tell a lot when I give such talks in different countries is that, okay, let's be very specific. There are very important basic things in decolonial thinking that should stay, like coloniality of knowledge, like coloniality of being, like what are the ways of decolonizing, you know, existential spheres of our life, and knowledge, of course, also because we are in the university, which is like the worst institution in modernity for colonizing minds. But at the same time, there are certain things, especially I would say the things that connect to what is happening in the world today, in which I see weaknesses in decolonial thinking, in which I would question that. And I mean, I would also say, going back to the time when I was just joining this group in 1999, 2000, when I first kind of met with the decolonial group and started collaborating with them, which is long ago, right? Already then I saw that there are certain tensions, there are certain frictions, that for a while they were fine, and now they're growing. They're just going like that, you know, and sometimes politically I find myself in a completely different camp, unfortunately. So this also has to be rethought. And what is amazing to me also is that the original decolonial kind of group, which, as you know, was Latin American, at first it was interested in expanding and joining other members. As you know, there are people from Southeast Asia, there are people from Eastern Europe, there are people from, you know, many other places, from Africa, of course. Many countries in Africa. But now it somehow shrinks back. I see that in the last years, several years, it kind of goes back to its original kind of groups and focuses, while people, for example, in Eastern Europe, they still call themselves decolonial, but they are very critical. And now there's several groups actually in Eastern Europe who are decolonial, but who are doing it in a very different way. Like just yesterday, I got a new book published by Ukrainian scholar living, by the way, in Latin America, Svetlana Bidarieva, and I will be writing a kind of a review for it, for one of the journals. It's called the term that she proposes is ambicoloniality, and that's her way of rethinking the colonial option and coming up with a new term when you think about Ukraine and when you think about situations like Ukraine being colonized by Russia, because it's very different from India, it's very different from Africa or any other places, but at the same time it is a form of coloniality, of course. So in that sense, it's interesting also what is happening and how it goes in different directions, and we don't know if they even should be called decoloniality or decolonial option any longer. Yeah, so I already mentioned that the linking is maybe not full enough. It's not it's promised, but it's not actually performed. And the discursive reproduction of Eurocentrism is quite visible in decolonial thought. One of the things that I find problematic is the binary models. Like in many texts, you read that, no, we're against binarity. Binarity is a modern colonial thing, yeah, great. But then if you look at how they frame things, very often it's still very binary. Like for example, if you take the classical colonizer-colonized binary, you know, of course, how problematic it is and how simplified it is. So it has to be kind of always remembered. And I mean, yes, there are wonderful decolonial texts like Sylvia Wynter, for instance, who talks for the third way, argues for the third way. But then she remains a little bit on the side, like people write about her, but her ideas are very seldom actually incorporated into decolonial thinking, while instead more and more we see this binarity. And one of my recent texts that is not even published yet, and I'm not sure it will be published, we'll see, I actually write about this double critique that was first formulated by Khatibi, Moroccan thinker, a long time ago. And at some point, the colonial option got interested in that. And I think it was very important to be interested in that because it allows to criticize not just the West, this kind of, demonized, homogenized West, but also see some local forms and sources of discrimination, of asymmetry of power, and that's what Khatibi tried to do in this text. And also there was another author, I think, feminist author Fatima Mernissi, who did the same, but in relation to feminism, speaking about the problems with Western feminism, but also the problems with local societies and the way they impose their binary conservative gender models and regimes on women in Morocco. So I think that this principle is very important. And actually, many years ago in 2006, I think, with Mignola, we tried to do a special issue on decoloniality or possible decolonial views in former Soviet Union. And we called it double critique because we wanted to use the same principle and explain how that there is this global coloniality, which of course is Western in its origin, but there are also local, imperial, post-imperial, neo-imperial threats. That's exactly how I envisioned it. But apparently I was wrong, because today, if you read what Walter is writing in his recent text, it wasn't his view of the situation, because today he claims that Russia is in this position of the victim. It's constantly discriminated by the West. So to me, this is one side of the story again. So it's this hatred of the West, which I totally agree with, and it's like a negative reaction to the West. But then a complete refusal to see that there are dictators there also, and that the local population is suffering as much from the local dictators, if not more, than from this global coloniality. And the same is true of Ukraine, of course, but with the changing of the poles. This is something that I think that I find threatening, that the decolonial option is sometimes losing this double or multiple critique element and ability, and is becoming very dualistic and very, very binary itself. So it's either or. It's either, sometimes I hear this here, this kind of arguments in Sweden as well. People say like, oh, you're so critical of Russia. You're almost like you love the US. And first of all, it doesn't make any sense any longer, as you know, with what's happening with Trump and Putin. But even before that, it didn't make any sense, because you can be critical of both, and you should be critical of both, because none of these poles are actually positive in any way for the colonized and indigenous populations. Of course, that's connected with our already mentioned, the constructing imaginary enemies as convenient rhetorical gestures. That happens a lot. And this is for what decolonial option has been and is criticized a lot, for this using the collective West, the homogenized Europe, which of course makes everybody kind of very mad in Europe, because Europe is very different, always was within itself. And even now you can see like it's very much scared of a possible attack from Putin, but at the same time, they cannot agree on many things, you know, and there are different local histories in Europe and different inter-imperial relations. And that's another thing, like, unfortunately, decolonial option almost forgot about one important category, which again, we formulated, I think first Walter formulated it, and then we wrote a couple of articles together 20 years ago on the imperial difference. So this imperial difference is crucial. And this is something that you don't find in post-colonial studies. And only recently, I think a few years ago, there was a book by an American scholar, Laura Doyle, on inter-imperiality. And this inter-imperiality is very similar to the imperial difference, meaning that there are different classes of empires. There are first-class empires like the British Empire, right, or the French Empire. But there are also second-rate empires like the Russian Empire, which is always trying to catch up with the West. During all its history, it wants to be included into this first league of the Western capitalist empires, but it's never allowed. And the story continues in Soviet Union, because again, in Soviet Union, you have this, you know, one of the slogans was let's catch up and leave America behind. So that spirit is there. And then it continues in post-socialist Russia. And, you know, the result of it is this war today and this attitude of this new imperial regime. So what I mean is that I'm not saying this to say, like, for example, like Walter Mignola does, or like Alexander Etkin does, oh, but then we should be more, we should be less critical of this empire because it's an empire that became a colony. No, it has not become a colony. It's actually even more cruel and more pathetic and more you know, clownish in the way it mimics Western empires of modernity. Because in most cases, what we see is that it borrows, it appropriates certain devices that were used by other empires, by French Empire, by British Empire mainly, but also by the US. And its treatment of Amerindians. So it uses these different tools, imperial tools, and then creates its own also, especially in Soviet times. And as a result, I think it's even more toxic and more cruel and more dehumanizing than the Western regimes that at least now pretend to, you know, follow human rights or whatever. So you cannot openly express your racism, while in Russia you can. It's like always was the point there and continues to be. Yeah, and another thing is this constructing, I said the constructing imaginary. Another thing is temporal models partially reproducing progressivist historical schemes. Why? Because, yeah, on the one hand, decolonial option is very critical of progressivism, of course, and this linear temporality. But on the other hand, when we try to construct certain, you know, trajectories of some social developments, cultural developments, they still continue to be very linear themselves. And that, of course, I see as a serious problem. But at the same time, I know how hard it is to overcome this. Because again, if we write a text in words and it's going to be published in an academic space or whatever, it has to be logocentric, it has to be progressivist, because this is how you express your ideas. And unfortunately, it's very, very much connected with how we think, how we are trained in thinking. And that, again, of course, shows us so many unresolved issues. Like we have to write in one of those modern colonial languages like English or French, right? Or even Spanish to some extent, not so much anymore, but still. In order to be read, and in order to be known, in order to have any audience. While, of course, if we continued in our indigenous languages, it would have been very different, right? Because in those languages, the temporal relations may be different, and maybe they are not based on this linear idea from the past to the present to the future. But as a result of this, I think, there is also one smaller issue here with temporality, because the colonial option refuses to speak about the future, refuses to imagine any futures politically. And I also find it problematic. Of course, you would tell me, no, it's not scholarly enough. It's not academic. You cannot discuss the future because we don't know what it will be like. Of course, but if we don't practice this kind of political imagination and political imaginaries, there will be no future, because then we are stuck with using the categories from the past. And this is what you see a lot today. People still operate with categories and binaries and concepts from the 20th century, while, of course, they make no sense today. And that kind of hesitance of decolonial thinkers, let's say, to go into this future direction, I find problematic. And I should say here that this is true about academic decolonialists, but it's not true about real decolonialists who are activists, who are on the ground. If you take the social movements in, for example, South Africa, or in the Andean region in the South America, Central America, right? These are people who are, and sometimes they're also artistic movements, so they're social/artistic movements. They think about the future all the time. They imagine their political futures. They try to, go into these sometimes minute details, imagining these alternative worlds, while also doing their everyday struggles, of course, and fighting for their cultural independence and autonomy. But at the same time, they're not afraid to go in that direction. And I think that it's really, really important and crucial. In my new book that I almost finished now, I start with one exercise like that I found very positive and very kind of refreshing and invigorating and liberating for myself. A few years ago, I was invited to answer a series of questions that were posed by a Georgian journal, Georgia country, I mean, not the state, but a country in South Caucasus. I don't know if you heard about it. Again, Georgia is a very colonialist name because it's made after a Russian Russified name of this country. In reality, its real name is Sakartvelo. So Sakartvelo had a very interesting journal, which was trying to deal with these political futures. And they imagine this political future as a free Caucasus. So it's a kind of free association or an alliance of Caucasian countries. And because my father was an indigenous person from the Caucasus, a Circassian, so for me, it's very close to my heart. And I do want the Caucasus to be free, but not only from Russia, because the northern part of Caucasus is still a colony where I'm from, right? And at the same time, I want the Caucasus to reunite, because historically it was always one region that survived together with all the influences from Iran, from the Khanate of Crimea, from Russia, from here and there. But at the same time, there is a Caucasian community of sense. So we were offered to imagine this. And, it's a wonderful exercise, because we were all writing in like 500 words, what will be the Caucasus in 100 years? Will it be independent? What will be the will be democratic or not? How it will be connected? What will be the relations between 200 different ethnicities living there, And it's amazing because you don't just reflect on that in a detached way, but you imagine that you're living there and you try to describe what kind of world it could be. So this is what I'm lacking in decolonial theorists who sit in Ivy League universities. And what I usually find in decolonial unknown figures, you know, like people on the ground living in Central Asia, or as I said, in Sakartvelo in Georgia, or in other places, and coming up with this really amazing pictures. Sometimes they visualize them through films, you know, making some video art, and I think that the future is there, not in us trying to express something helplessly in this kind of westernized sort of, you know, rationalized model and publish it in some peer-reviewed journal. Yeah, and another thing is I also notice I need to mention this is anthropocentric biases that are very slowly lifted in the colonial option. Like originally it was very anthropocentric. And that was a puzzling thing for me because, you know, on the one hand, when you criticize modernity / coloniality, of course, one of the basic main things that you criticize is the nature-culture divide. Because this nature-culture divide allows actually the anthropocentrism to come forward and allows to also say that all other people that are not white and not Western and not European are not quite people, right? They're not, they can be then dehumanized and put closer to nature. So the nature-culture divide is in the basis of racism as well. But unfortunately, although they said that, but they didn't go further. And not in many original decolonial texts, you find these entanglements with new materialism, maybe even critique of new materialism as still a very Eurocentric discourse, you know, but a critique are more involved into this, like interspecies dialogues with this kind of defending life, not only human life, and not only, let's say, human rights, but also rights of other species, of other beings sharing the planet with us. In that respect, there are exceptions again, but mostly you find them in indigenous discourses in Latin America, if we still stick to Latin America. In India, there are many examples, like Vandana Shiva is the most well-known example, of course, but there are other less-known theorists who try to do exactly that. So they are very radical in their political views, some of them decolonial, but they are also, they include in this discussion this you know, biological diversity and the importance of this care for the living world, let's say. And the newer thing I didn't even include it here is, of course, the technological coloniality. That's another thing, like the AI and all that, you know, robots, artificial intelligence. This is a very important form of coloniality that, again, is only mentioned in most decolonial texts, but nobody really goes deep enough. And I think we should do that, because this is something that questions, again, our humanity. It questions our ontological characteristics in the near future already. And that leads us, again, a little bit to the future. Why? Because if we look at the people today who decide the future of the world, and, you know, like if you read any of the texts by Elon Musk, for instance, you see something that I think was recently defined by Naomi Klein as a technological kind of fascism of the end world, right? Meaning that with their accelerationist tendencies, they really want to bring the end of the world very quickly and very close to us, right? So they're not trying to save anything or even keep the status quo anymore. It's more about, okay, let's accelerate even more so we're done with this planet and we can go elsewhere. But of course, the majority of the population then will be the abandoned populations. And why I'm saying this? Because this is, again, you see that right in front of us, there is this restructuring, the social and political restructuring. So all of these categories that the colonial option is still using will be rethought and are already rethought. So there will be racism based not on skin color, or the purity of blood, but on how, or do you have access to this accelerationism? Do you have access to becoming a superhuman or post-human with some, you know, elements of AI ingrained into your brain. So then you are the chosen, you are selected to live, while others who are not enhanced technologically, they are the new, dehumanized population. So that's another thing that I think also needs to be taken into account and is not enough taken into account. Yeah, okay. I already mentioned that, so I will not go into detail on that. Hijacking the colonial jargon for colonialist purposes, and also the status quo purposes, and the fundamentalist, nationalist, extreme right appropriations. That, of course, is we all know that. The imperial difference I mentioned. Yeah, maybe if I still have like a few minutes, I should say something about the feminist part, because Bula asked me specifically to focus on this. So I think that actually, as long as we look at the original decolonial group, before Maria Lugones comes into the picture, the feminist element is very much hushed. But when Maria comes, Maria, of course, for me is like the role model, because she is much more subtle, much more interesting and complex in her ideas than most of the colonial thinkers, if you allow me to say this. But it's also interesting that Maria's earlier works that were written before the colonial option was launched in the 1980s, for instance, are again much more subtle and interesting and complex than what she writes when this coloniality of gender comes into picture. And I'm not original here. There are several people who notice that. And we can reflect on that too, why it happens, and how the creation of theory with a capital letter and kind of, making the coloniality into this bronze monument to itself also changes the way people write. But I still think that Maria is amazing in her ideas, and she should be specifically mentioned with her trajectory towards decolonial feminism. One of her earlier works that I'm sure you heard about is this article about traveling to other people's worlds with a loving perception. And it's not the loving perception that usually people pay attention to that is most interesting here. It's, again, the way she focuses on one of the key syndromes of modernity, that of agonistics. I think it's amazing, and it works so well. You can see how agonistics works also not only in modernity as such, but also in this victimhood rivalry that we see a lot. There are different narratives of victimhood that fight with each other, and that's very good for modernity, because then we are busy fighting with each other and deciding who suffered more and who kind of deserves more cookies for that, but meanwhile they are doing their thing, that they are remodeling the world and redividing the world. So she writes about this agonistics, and she calls it the arrogant perception and non-arrogant perception. So how to formulate and how to cultivate in yourself the non-arrogant perception of other people, of the world, of other species, when you are not playing with them in order to win, when you are not doing something because of your arrogance, because of your hubris of the 0 point, as Santiago Cáceres Gomez calls it. So this traveling to other people's world is easier. With a loving perception, it's easier said than done. But I think without it, we cannot find any common grounds, any transversal coalitions for anything, which people now need to do, because otherwise we're going to just, disappear from the face of the world very soon. So this arrogant perception and agonistic playing. And even earlier than that, I think she wrote an article about impurity and curdling, which I also like very much. So she talks about purity and impurity, not only in everyday life, but also in our political imaginaries in relation to the nation state. And in the fact that I think indirectly it questions the binarity, this purity of binary oppositions, and shows how actually they are messy, and how each of our positions is always impure and always contaminated with something. And why she uses the word curdling, because she always uses, as many feminists do, some kitchen metaphors. So she starts with a memory of making mayonnaise at home in her kitchen with her mother. and explains how this impurity it can be actually visualized in the way different substances, they are mixed or not mixed, and the way they mix and the way emulsion comes up. So I find it's a wonderful article. And then later she also comes up with the idea of deep coalitions, which I always quote to my students. Again, it's very difficult to explain to somebody who is still fighting or arguing for some grand narrative and thinks that everybody has to agree on everything to fight for something, which is no longer the case. So deep coalition is about how can we keep our differences, because they are super important. So we're all different. But at the same time, we should still be able to build these deep coalitions that go beyond these differences, not to homogenize, not to create, this homogeneity and make everybody the same or make them forcefully happy in a certain prescribed way. But find something that we all consider to be important. And that is an open question. What do we consider to be most important that would still make us a human species, different representatives of human species, fight together and form deep coalitions despite our differences and despite our different histories? I don't know, maybe it's because I've spent the last 10 years of my life in Sweden. It has certain interests and it changes your perspective. For me now, it's the climate change. And there are climatic differences and the crisis that is coming. And of course, you know how it will be also human-oriented in the sense that there will be 3 billion of refugees because of the climate and environmental problems by the end of the century. So it's not only about the environment, it's also about what will happen to our species as a result of this, right? So I think this is one of the challenges that could actually, at least potentially, create deep coalitions. But instead of that, we have this going back to 19th century geopolitics, which we all witness now. And so this, of course, is connected with this human non-human as a central dichotomy of colonial modernity that Lugones also writes about in many of her texts, including the classical article about the coloniality of gender and the modern colonial gender system and coloniality of gender. And again, I would not go too much detail on that. It's a wonderful article and you can all read it. You can find it in free access. But it's interesting that this article was criticized a lot, first of all, in Latin America by many Latin American anthropologists who write about the Andean societies prior to colonization, and they disagreed with her ideas and said that, no, you romanticize these pre-Columbian societies. They were not so ideal, they also had some forms of patriarchy. And that, to me, it completely misses the point, because this is not what she was writing about. She was not trying to romanticize any pre-colonial societies, but she just showed that it was a completely different gender sexual order that was not ideal, no, but it was based on completely different principles. And then what happens is that colonization brings its own very specific and very rigid gender and also sexual, of course, and religious order, as a result of which everything changes, right? And people lose their own old connections and logic in these relationships. And it's also interesting, they internalize the new ones. And so after several generations, they start believing that this is actually our tradition, this is how we always lived. I think that it's true. When I read this article, I got really interested and I wrote a whole book about that, about the gender relations in Central Asia, where my mother is from, and in the Caucasus, where my father is from, and how it was all changed as a result of the Russian colonization. But then again, it's not the end of the story, because the Russian colonization is relatively new in historical times. And before that were different other kinds of colonizations, nearby proto imperial or just stronger states, with their cultural influences, including Islam. That's an interesting thing, that Islam can be also looked at from different perspectives here. And when I speak with many of my, friends, artists and activists in Central Asia, their attitude to Islam actually is very complex. And this double critique starts kicking in, and Central Asia is more interested in going back to some pre-Islamic even traditions and looking at what happened as a result of this Islamic influence. So it's even more complicated. I'm just trying to say that there are many more layers here that need to be taken into account than maybe in the case of Amerindians that Maria writes about. That I already mentioned. Just trying to see purity, impurity. Right. Well, maybe to just finish the whole thing, if you allow me to have like 2-3 minutes, I wanted to share with you some of the things I really am interested in, much more than academic writing. I work a lot with artists,
Madina,
especially in Central. Yeah?
Yeah, you have full 1 hour, so up to 3:35 or 3:40.
Oh, yeah, but maybe we could have questions. I'm more
Sure.
interested in listening to your discussion than just talking like that here as a talking head. But anyway, so I wanted to share with you some of the things I really care about. I deal with a lot with artists, and many of them are also activists, mostly in Central Asia and the Caucasus. And I go a lot there, and I see their grassroots movements. Like, for example, soon there will be an opening of a new, very interesting Museum of Contemporary Art in Kazakhstan, in Almaty. And the first project that they're going to show is about one of the Barsakelmes, is like a lake which is disappearing in Kazakhstan due to Soviet and partly post-Soviet also ecological disasters, the same as with Aral Sea. And so these artists are not just making art about this, they're also actively fighting. They're actively fighting with the state, they're protesting. And so one of the elements goes in that direction, which I wanted to mention. And another is of memory, because most of these colonial memories were completely erased in Soviet times, and people were given a certain sanitized national histories that were created in Moscow, and they had to believe in those. And so only now they're remembering and going back to these really horrible moments of Soviet colonialism. In Kazakhstan, one of those moments, which is similar to Ukraine, but in Ukraine is Holodomor, when several million people died of hunger, which is organized by Stalin's regime. And in Central Asia, and especially in Kazakhstan, it's a little bit less. It's between 2 and 3 million people who died, but still a lot. So why they died? Because they were forced into collective farms, and they didn't want to go into collective farms because these are nomadic people of Central Asia, right? So they didn't want to become sedentary and work in collective farms. Many of them were well-off people with land, with horses and everything. So everything was taken away from them, and they were left with nothing. And some of them managed to escape to China and to Mongolia, and their descendants still live there today, and some of them are very difficult conditions. So one of my good friends in Kazakhstan, she made this project, and it's called Ashershlik. And Ashershlik in Kazakhstan is this, how they call this big famine. And how does she do these projects? You see that they're strangely looking because it's not a painting. It's actually made based on archival photograph. And this archival photograph of these people who are trying to escape, and they're dying of hunger, they're left with nothing, they don't want to be under the Soviet regime. So she took the photograph and then she remade it as a collage, let's say, right, made of plastic bags. So Saule she works with plastic bags and calls it plastic paintings. And these plastic bags, they are garbage, right? So we always bring her new and more plastic bags of different colors. And she put it into a project that is called a residual memory, which I really like, because residual in this case means that the plastic bags are residual. It's very hard for them to decompose, so they stay forever, in the environment. But memory is also residual. So after all of these decades, when people were not allowed to open their mouth and say anything about Eshashar and now they still remember. There are still memories, there's still songs, there's still, you know, writings and things. You can see some people who survived that somehow, right? So that to me is an interesting way of kind of artistic playing with this. And then if we manage to do this, maybe, this is, I will show you a very short abstract. It's a very young, also Kazakhstan artist, Medina Bazargali, who made this project, Decolonization of Kurt. Kurt, I don't know how to explain this. It's a very national thing. So it's like a milk product, dairy product. So it's salty, sour pieces of curdled milk. I'm not sure it exists in other countries, but it's a very typical thing because you can take it in this dried form, take it with you when you are, you know, traveling around, so it won't go bad. And so what she did in this project, she tried to contaminate this kurt, which is a national symbol of Kazakhstan, with some yeast and some other cultures, and to show them how colonization works, because it's a visualization of what happens when this colonization of your mind, of your thinking goes very deep, and then it's not possible to clean it. So let's watch maybe a short abstract. Oops. She's speaking about the history of Kazakhstan, how it was formed as a Soviet Socialist Republic. So that's the kind of parallel idea of your colonization of minds and education and everything. Well, you get the idea. So while we're looking at this contamination process, we also listen to these main events in the Kazakhstan new history, and we hear how first this Soviet Republic was created, and then how they started fighting against Kazakhstan nationalism, or bourgeois nationalism, it was called in Soviet times, and how all this Kazakhstan intelligentsia was basically exterminated or put into prison in the 1920s and 1930s, and then what happened after that. And then in the second part of the video, she tries to kind of clean this court from all of this contamination of coloniality, but of course it's not possible. It goes very deep and inside the product. And the last thing I wanted to show you, I know that you're tired, it's very difficult to listen like that online. It's a very different, a very poetic decolonial abstract from one of my favorite, if not the favorite, decolonial Central Asian Uzbek filmmaker, Saudat Ismailova. And the film is called 40 Days of Silence. And I recently wrote an article about it, and it's a really an amazing film. And for me, it is a kind of an example of a double critique, because here there's always this larger socialist, Soviet modernity looming behind, which takes people's lives, it forces them to do certain things, like in this case, it's a story of Uzbek people who were forced to fight in World War II on the Soviet side, although it wasn't their war at all. So that is looming there. But at the same time, it's a critique of the local society and its patriarchal, heteropatriarchal norms, because it's a story of a young girl, and she comes to her grandmother to heal after she was mistreated in her family, or maybe by her boyfriend, we don't know. And so one of the treatments that is offered for such girls in Central Asia is to go through this ritual of 40 days of silence. Chilla is called. It's in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan as well. So let's try to look this. It's very short. Sorry, it's just it will finish soon. Advertisement. Okay. Okay. So I will stop sharing. Stop sharing.
Madina,
Thank you very much.
Before you have left, what give me a summation, sort of the ones you have shown. But I don't want to ask this question prior because there are in the chat box other people who wrote before me. But I thought since this small video is going to finish, so I want to ask the question about what is the main sort of chat. I'm looking for the chats. Tagalog chat. Okay. There are questions in the chat.
Uh-huh.
You can-
Okay, there is a question in the chat, yes.
Right. See,
In science, development means based on past understanding, getting to a newer framework of understanding. Why is that an anathema for social scientists in describing the shifts in understanding, which need not be constrained by linguistic colonialism? Okay, let's see again. There's too many developments and understandings here. Okay, development. Right. I don't think it's an anathema, but in some cases it is. It depends on what position you are speaking from, and what are you a kind of philosophic realist? Are you a constructivist? And but unfortunately, even if we know about all of these things happening, and they actually started happening, these questionings, and back in the 80s and 90s, if you take conventional research in these areas of social sciences, especially, they are still very positivist a lot of times, and in Europe, I was surprised to find that yes, they read all the postmodernists and post-constructivists, but they're still very, very positivist in how they frame research. And they also require this from the students. So you have to be super careful, especially when you're writing about such questionable and sensitive things to Europeans as colonialism and ongoing coloniality. Then they come up with all sorts of questions. Yeah, but this is on ground that you have to prove first that actually there is racism in Sweden. You cannot just claim that there is racism. You have to give us evidence, So there's a lot of that, unfortunately, going on.
Professor Thakur, you want to add anything? You can unmute yourself. If you want to add anything or you are not satisfied with the answer, unmute yourself. Unmute.
Yeah, I can. Yeah. Essentially, my take would be, the second take would be when you are talking about the AI related issues. Again, from a scientific point of view, the development in the AI need not be viewed as a Frankenstein aspect of changes that is bound to come.
I'm sorry, there is such a huge echo. I cannot understand what you're talking about because you are echoing yourself 3-4 times here in Sweden. So wonderful technology, yes. Okay, so what was the question again? That we shouldn't be afraid of AI? Nobody's afraid of AI, but it's just kind of people either fetishize it or they're scared of it instead of being critical enough and also knowing what is its space. And decolonialists, they just kind of dismiss it instead of engaging with it more seriously. That's what my take about it, on it, let's say. Yes. It's a question, I think. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
I don't have any further comment. Yeah. That's Laura.
Thank you.
Bula, can you hear me?
If I unmute, there will be echo. Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, okay. Well, I appreciate very much Madina Tlostanova speech, and I found it full of insights, especially around the technological coloniality and the double critique beside feminism and decoloniality. I think it is really important to break the dualism, colonizer, colonized, because very often we found the two things together in the same state, and to focus on the imperial difference, as she is inviting us to do. I would like, my question is if Madina Tlostanova can expand on the anthropocentric bias, because this is really an important center of our limitations, and how to go over temporal models, this progressivism that we have in Western countries, which is predominant, versus indigenism, which has a different type of relation with time and space. So I think this be so important to have a reflection, the opportunity of a reflection with her, which was part of the first book I read in the past on feminism and decoloniality. So thank you again.
Thank you very much, Laura. Yeah, I also find it's very important, and that's why I think I prefer decolonial feminist texts like Maria's and others that actually reflect more on this. They're very much aware of that, and especially if you take also Latin American indigenous feminist movements, they are really questioning this boundary, right? And they always, I think it's because it comes from their very different kind of worlding, the way they frame the world, the way they relate to the world. And there is this relationality that is so much destroyed in us all by modernity, by the kind of schooling we get. I mean, if you go to any university, it will destroy this idea, because the university education is based on this alienation from the world, on this, individualism on the one hand. On the other hand, you are constantly scolded for not being objective. And so that's another thing, that you are then hiding behind the discipline. You're then, doing all that sorts of dangerous things. And so, I mean, we have to learn from these indigenous and colonized populations, I guess. And it's also tricky, because it depends on who is doing that and if their perception is extractivist, arrogant, or what, right? So sometimes it looks very fake when a white person from Europe comes and also all of a sudden starts borrowing some concepts from indigenous thinking. That has been criticized a lot too, right? So in that sense, I'm, for example, more interested when people here in Sweden, they try to go back to their own traditions and maybe go back to what they were themselves before modernity. And I like to trigger that in them, like I sometimes go with my Swedish colleagues and I say, oh, look, this is a herb that can be used for this and that in my culture. If you're sick, you can use this herb. And here you have it in the park, and it's just for decorative purposes. And they start thinking about it. Say, oh, yeah, we used to use it in that way too, but it was before modernity. And so I say, well, so maybe you should remember what you had before modernity and what kind of perspective you had before modernity. So in Europe, it's more about this, I think, about decolonizing their own past. that was pre-modern and maybe was in some ways comparable to this indigenous thinking. And if you are lucky and you're indigenous or partly, and you have this connection to the land, and to these traditions, then it's of course easier. But the problem is how to make it mainstream, or not maybe mainstream, I don't like the word mainstream, but more visible and heard and taken into account. Because, for example, here in Sweden, everybody is into new materialism. So people are constantly quoting Braidotti and all that, And when we come and say, yeah, but all of these ideas are not new, they were already and are already in all indigenous traditions and cosmologies. So it's interesting that in Europe, they have to come to this understanding very late and through science. It's only when scientists tell them, okay, this is how it works, yeah? So then they can believe it because it's this scientific kind of, authority. But if it's some indigenous story, it's just a myth. Nobody pay attention to that. So now I think the most interesting works are the ones that come together, that want to say, oh, okay, so this is what is expressed in this so-called new materialism, but you can find this also in parallel in all of these wisdom traditions, and so it's interesting to see if a dialogue is possible, on what terms, where are the limitations, because they are doing similar things, but they just use different rationalities for that, and it's not to dismiss any of them. It's to try to see if this deep coalition is possible among them. I think in most of decolonial writing, they are learning slowly. I mean, there's no longer this discussion only of human rights. They write more and more about life rights and include into this life category other species and the planet and all that. But to me, I think the lacking part, maybe you disagree with me, I don't know. The lacking part is what would be the reason of saving life, because nobody discusses that. Like I sometimes play this role of a devil advocate, and we say, oh, we have to care for the continuation of life on the planet, or we have to do this and that, and I say, okay, but why you want to do that? So I think that there should be some, not teleology maybe, but some more pronounced ethical reflection there, which is missing. And it's also, I think, part of this problem that it was created during the post-structuralist times of relativism, when people didn't want to discuss some, big values or ideas that everybody should share. But without them, it's sometimes risky too, because then you lose completely this purpose, but we have to be careful with that, of course, because it's very dangerous as a weapon, so to say. Yeah, thank you for the question.
Okay, Professor Alatar has a question.
Yeah, I do. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. I really appreciate the its provocative nature, because we really do need to be self-critical. I mean, those of us involved in decolonizing knowledge. So they're just a couple of points that I wanted to ask you about. One is this problem of academic research, problem of academia. You are saying that we are constrained by academia. We must publish in journals, and that dictates how we write, and it also perhaps makes our work less accessible to people outside of academia. But I wanted to suggest that it may not necessarily be this distinction between academic versus real decolonizers, and I think you used that expression, because I think in my own experience in my part of the world, there are many academics who write in journals, but who at the same time speak to the public. In fact, in my own case, in the Malaysian context, most of my discussions, most of my talks are to the public and to non-academics. when I talk about decolonization. I don't know why it's like that, but I have far fewer invitations in Malaysia to speak, in universities on decolonization than outside the universities. So, and I think from what I know, this is also true in other countries, in Indonesia, in Iran, in Turkey, some of the places that I'm familiar with. So, there isn't that necessarily that divide between academia and let's say civil society. So I'm wondering whether that is really the problem. Also, I feel that academics, or rather activists outside of academia, civil society, for example, are influenced by academics either directly or indirectly, and vice versa. That's definitely the case. I know, for example, some of the work of indigenous people. I'm thinking specifically of an indigenous person in Malaysia who became a novelist and writes novels. He's not, educated in the way that we think of education, but his works are extremely important in terms of how they influence the way we think about decolonization. So maybe the issue is more that academics, it's not that they shouldn't write scientific stuff, but they should make themselves more accessible to non-academics, and to speak not only in the universities, but also to non-academics, and also to realize that their concepts and ideas, they have to, when they think about decolonization, they need to learn from non-academics, rather than have the arrogance that, we are the ones who conceptualize and build theory. So that was just one point which I thought you might reflect on. My other point is this, about the hijacking of decolonization by ethno-nationalists, by other hegemonic orientations, and we know of many examples of this. Hindutva in India, Malay ethno-nationalism in Malaysia, and so on and so forth. And this is true. And I think you were critiquing decolonial thinkers for not addressing that enough. But what I wanted to point out is that for those of us who are involved in decolonization of knowledge, and I mean decolonization of knowledge, not restricted to decolonial thought, but in the broader sense of the term, we had, for decades already, and I know this, from the 80s, from the 90s, had already critiqued this problem, but under the heading of nativism. So from the very beginning, in Indian context, for example, in the Philippines, in other places, we had always cautioned against becoming nativistic, even as we critique, coloniality, or we critique Eurocentrism, Eurocentric scholarship. So we had cautioned about going to the other extreme, which was called nativism. But I think, what you're saying is that people in the decolonial tradition are less, less perceptive of this problem. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, the question of academia, of course, it's obvious what you said, and this is what I myself been doing. I speak much more outside academia. I hate when it's some university conference, it's so useless. I mostly speak for other people, and that's why I also don't like to write academic articles, because if you write a text for the public, like for a catalog or for something, it's much more efficient, but then you use different language. Then sometimes when you go back to academia, they think you're not scientific enough because you already started writing in an accessible way. I do that too. But the problem is more this, more noticeable maybe thing now, that I see a lot of indigenous movements in Latin America that are very unhappy with these people who live in the US. And look from their already vantage point there, you know, because they're not involved. It's not their daily problem to survive or to be, you know, persecuted or something. That I think creates more tension. And also the way you appropriate it or the way you use it. For example, when Walter Mignolo writes and uses the concept of Anzaldúa in his original books, or Silvia Rivera Cosicanchi, I know that Walter is not doing it because he is appropriating or it's not his idea, no, but this is how they see it. This is how Silvia sees it and says, I don't allow you to quote me anymore, because for her, it becomes a political project. Like, no, these people are just, you know, expropriators of our knowledge. And sometimes it gets really stuck. Like I had a really wonderful, very smart PhD student once who couldn't finish a project partly because when she went to Brazil, I think, to take some interviews from the local feminist activists, she felt her guilt as somebody privileged coming from the global north, being in Swedish academia and not having the right to extract this knowledge from them, on what terms, and should I put them as my co-authors in my PhD dissertation? You see, this is a clash of how this academia works. So I had to say, no, you're fine. You come from lower classes yourself, even if you're white. It's okay. You're also just a student. So, you know, it's really, it becomes very unhealthy sometimes. I agree with that. And yes, you're right that a lot of artists that I was showing you, they would read my article and just take a concept, a decolonial concept out of it and play with it. And so it's mutual in that sense. But I see this, maybe it's, you know, it's also different in your country or in Turkey or in Central Asia even than in the US and in Europe. Here, the academia is especially dead and especially detached from this social context and real life, you know. Actually, we are told, like in Sweden, I think it's even the rule, it's the law, like you have to keep politics at elbow distance from any research, you know, or any, which is very unhealthy because, I mean, everything is political, as you know. So maybe it's also the context that creates this. And this is one of the arguments that easily comes, you know, when you speak, oh yeah, but these people, these decolonial theorists, they sit in this Ivy League universities, so whatever they write is known. Yeah, there is this hierarchy too, of course, of who is known and in what capacity and how. But I think that I agree with you, and I write that a lot also in my works, that there should be more collaborations and we should organize and be part of other movements and other events that are on the verge or between university and academic life and social life and cultural life. And then it creates really interesting collaborations and intertwinings that have the future, because this is where new ideas are born. Yeah. So nativism, yes, I know, of course, about that. I think what I meant more in this case is that the situation got really toxic with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And then this lack of decolonial voices or their really problematic texts that they published, both Walter Mignolo and what's his name, Grasvogel, very much on the Russian side, that made them almost cancelled in Eastern Europe, you know. And we had a lot of discussions and almost kind of arguments about that. And I understand that they're so much against the West, this collective West, that they are ready to kind of pardon any dictator that if this dictator is criticizing the West, but it's not going to work. And it's again about these different narratives that are clashing. You know, you have a global leftist anti-colonial narrative, which of course is wonderful and very powerful, and we all agree with that. But then there is these local problems here, like the anti-Soviet relative, and this specific thing that the Russian Empire was never part of any post-colonial studies, and people were not aware of the Soviet Union colonialism and all that. So that, I think, clashes. And that makes a lot of people very unhappy, of course, about the whole situation. And that's why I always tell Walter, you should write about this. You should kind of engage with this critique. And so now he's working on this text, I think, in which he will criticize or at least explain what's the difference.
Can I just add to that? I agree with you. And sometimes when they take that position, it damages decolonization movement. You know, for example, a similar example to what you're talking about, Iran, right? Many people are happy about what Iran, did in terms of its foreign policy, its anti-imperialist stance. But then the same people ignore the brutality within Iran. The
Yes.
problems, lack of academic freedom and human rights issues and so on. And then, then decolonizing becomes associated with this kind of myopia. So,
Yes.
we need to constantly call those things out. I agree.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Professor Dasgupta, you have any question? Because I have lots, so I'm the last one.
Am I audible?
Yeah, you're perfectly audible.
So, I enjoyed the discussion and the lecture, and it was really interesting to see that the academics admitting that it is dead, it has to reach out from its closet and and reach out to the non-academic as well. And I would sort of add that from non-academic to whether it could reach the activists as well. To be making it more effective, the decolonization of the mind and decolonization movement. So you referred to the Russian, the present day colonizing movements in Ukraine. There are other examples also, China, in Taiwan, and then in US, the idea of making Canada another state also comes from the same kind of colonization move. So it's everywhere. So I wonder sometimes, it's not a question, what are we doing? Just watch and see this grow. We had an organization called the United Nations. What it is doing, whether the movement, there can be a movement from the academia itself to pressurize to that this is nobody supports colonization. So to make it more worldwide, more strong, why can't these strong powers, at least there should be a resistance from the United Nations itself to, sort of counter the colonization movement, the new colonization that's coming through the countries that matter. So why can't this be happening, or why can't this begin somewhere? So that was my rather a curiosity rather than a question.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I wish I knew, right? I wish we had a recipe for that. Absolutely. It's would be so important, but it's lacking. And that's what I also meant by this lacking dialogues, transversal coalitions, because, even the word solidarity was contaminated due to this kind of socialist and communist, meanings of this. So people got rid of it and basically forgot. And as a result, we have these little smaller and smaller groups with their specific targets and ideas and concepts, and they just don't deal with each other. Well, UN, yes, but the UN itself as an organization is politically outdated because you know how it was created and based on what principles. And so I think there is a clash there with, again, Soviet Union previously being one of the founding members as a result of World War II and all that. And so now there is this clash with precisely that country violating the main international law principles. And so what would they do? So it has to be radically reformed somehow. But again, there is no political will globally that would actually initiate that process. And I also think that academia could be one of those. But then the question is, what is the role of academia in today's society? When we are just shrinking to the role of experts and when we are constantly being pulled out or pulled towards either the state and its ideologies or corporations, which is more often even happening here, for instance, in the West, then what do we do? How do we keep our academic freedom, independence? It's all now gone, I think, in most cases. I don't know, maybe in India you have a different situation, but in Europe we can feel that and that pressure really.
Well, Should I now say something? Madina, thank you very much from your busy schedule. And it was a wonderful, presentation to hear. Although sometimes I disagree, and one or 2 points I'll tell, not the whole thing, then they have another narrative. My first disagreement, of course, will start with Professor Thakur, that in science, developments are made from the past, but then science become very modeled. It's kind of a model orientation. That is why I think in 1936, there is this concept of, not so modeling thing. That means chaos theories and uncertainty principle was introduced to science even, that science cannot even certainly discuss, discover catastrophes, developments, change. It is, I mean, Professor Thakur and me are colleagues for 30 years. So we disagree all these 30 years, and still today, I think what we mean by science are kind of, very much within a cage. So I don't think that I like to be in cage in terms of thinking. In terms of thinking, I like to experiment, know, rather say disagree. For example, in India, decolonization and decoloniality are not actually popular concepts, but people do discuss decolonization, but not tell that this is decolonization. Or we practice decoloniality also, but do not say it. Like we practice coloniality tremendously. So coloniality still has the hegemonic position on decoloniality. That is what I think, staying in India and working on India. But what I would say is this, that this actually started of what I should be or should not be when I was in North America, in at McMaster University doing my sociology MA and PhD. There I thought I would criticize, McMaster being a very liberal left school, I'll criticize Marx, what he said on Asia. And there I realized that how much coloniality was in actually action. My supervisor was, Marxist by so much nomenclature, and told me that no, you cannot write against Marx this way. I asked a simple question. Still, I ask all other thinkers, they think that British colonization has developed, so-called development done in India. Other than that, India was a stupid village communities. That is anybody God that you cannot question? We know that we don't question gods. They say, let there be light, let there is light. But there is no light, there is darkness all over. So is Marx was God? Then he said, it's not a question of God. It's a question of, if you criticize Marx this way, and you say that everything said Marx wrong in India, which I did, of course, then I won't be able to give you the thesis. Simple as that. This subclause he didn't utter. So I could say that I experienced colonization of knowledge in the heyday of the, American leftism, so-called left liberalism in the late 70s in the universities, that each and every, probably, but that only got caught, or rather I was saved from thinking all Western, academics are like this. When my supervisor sent the thesis to Paul Sweezy, so that my thesis is rejected. But interestingly, to his utter surprise, and mine too, I fell down and had a leg fracture, because when I heard that Paul Sweezy is my external. Paul Sweezy, external, can you imagine? A doctoral candidate, early 30s, I was 32 then. And Paul Sweezy wrote back that this is the kind of thesis we should actually get from the young Marxist. I'd like to congratulate this young person for writing such a brave thing. And I thought I should make it a, plaque and everywhere stand, but I didn't do that. That is too obvious. But that's when I understand there is diversity. When we criticize so-called Europe, there is diversity. We have to distinguish as decolonial scholars. And secondly, the diversity of paths and actions. See, this is decoloniality, so you follow decoloniality. This is the United Nations model of keeping peace. What is going on in Afghanistan, and apparently United Nations has a big peacekeeping force there. Doesn't make much sense. So what, Madina, I don't know whether you'll agree with me. First thing is that what we say must put into some kind of action and process, even though we will be hurt by that. I know I have been hurt all through my career in India and sometimes outside also in terms of publishing books and articles, that I am not actually thinking that India developed during British rule. Rather, I thought India had underdeveloped. If we want to use the word development, then I would use in the terms of that underdevelopment of India. So dependent capitalism of India, which actually, became very fruitful to the British, to the colonizer. And still now, if we get a publication outside of India, that's read more. My Indian publications are read less, but I'm the same person with same dedication. I'm writing each of the piece. So I think what I always say that I'm a scholar activist. I just don't believe in doing that. So that's the second point I think decolonial researchers should actually consider. Doesn't matter which discipline. Reality is never discipline specific. Reality is reality. That's why we have killed in the name of industrial development the whole of environment, the whole of nature. Now they are killing us. Now nature is taking away. So obviously, when we do decolonial studies, we have to be interdisciplinary. And if we become discipline specific, we become narrow scientists, ivory tower scientists. So obviously, that's why I also disagree with Professor Thakur, my longtime colleague, and my vice chancellor also at some point of time, that science, basic science are models, in the laboratory. But outside laboratory, there is chaos, there is uncertainty principle. So obviously, we have to take care of that also. That if you give COVID, apparently we were given COVID vaccine, but that is the most untruth of this century, that COVID disease never developed any vaccine. It was all pharmaceutical industries hoax. And that particular year, 2021, 1920, 2021, pharmaceutical industry surpassed every industry's profit, most profitable industry in terms of billion. But none of us got COVID one. What happened after was that most people had some kind of reaction. Some people have heart attacks, allergies, diarrhea type of things, but nobody knows the cure of that. So obviously, the hoax of development, the hoax of that we are curing things are too much because they have the big capital. I'm specifically talking like a radical, like Ivan Illich, the schooling society, or Navarro. Okay, so naturally we should understand that even though we work within the university's atmosphere, we have to obey, but at the same time, obey and disobey are dialectical process. If you obey continuously, nothing comes out of it. Until unless you disobey, that means you think why you are saying that. You have to think and question why you are saying that women scientists, women didn't have scientific understanding. So we have very few number of still Nobel Peace Prize of Science among women. So obviously in layers there are questions. Why did British came to India? Vasco da Gama in 1498 and 1506, Thomas Roe. That time Mughal rule was there. Because India was very rich at time with merchant capital. Huge analysis have shown that India was much developed than British. And British was actually taking things from India. It is called loot and plunder, the first stage of colonialism. So obviously, it sounds like a lecture, but I don't want to lecture. I want to finish here saying that the decoloniality scholars, researchers, teachers, whoever, ordinary person in films, person in arts, designs, science, social science, humanities, whatever the divisions are, we got to question and practice decoloniality. I here stop. I mean, Professor Thakur is free to criticize me, so is Madina and anybody for that matter. We are a very small group after all. See, decoloniality doesn't have popular basis. We have less people in hearing this. Madina.
Well, I mean, of course, I agree with you, absolutely. The question is how to do it. So in that sense, I sometimes miss the times when I could be more of an activist and when there were some parallel worlds in which I could be, because in Sweden, it's very much impossible, let's say. There are no social movements here where I could join, you know.
It's first in the list of equality.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are issues in Sweden, but I mean, there are a lot of, for example, environmental social movements. And there are many very specific immigrant or refugee movements, which are, of course, not liked by the state, right? But this is not decolonial. It's very different from, I was not able in 10 years to explain to them what is decoloniality, because people who claim here that they do decolonial stuff are really not doing that. You know, they understand it in either a very old-fashioned way, because they immigrated in 1970s and they stopped in that kind of period of how anti-colonial thinking looked then, or they are hostile to this because it's too kind of complex and theoretical and going too much into non-descriptive, but as you said, this interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, disobedient, delinking kind of thinking, which they're not happy about. I would say that the only group
it's also a colonial pattern, academic.
Absolutely, of course.
Absolutely a colonial pattern, the silos.
Yeah, the only group I kind of am friends with and collaborate is the Sami people, because in Sweden there is this group of Sami indigenous people who were mistreated for many centuries by Swedes, right? And by when they were kind of building their nation state, and still are. I mean, they lose their territories, their way of life. So with these groups, yes, I identify. But again, it's sometimes difficult because I'm indigenous, but I'm not Sami. So in that sense, my acceptance there is provisional, let's say, right? So we have alliances, but it's not my own struggle, let's say. So yeah, absolutely. And that's why I think I work with artists so much, because these artists that I mentioned, they are activists. They are actually in the streets protesting. And so through them and through writing texts for them and through thinking together on their future artistic projects, I kind of do my activism, but I really sometimes miss the time when I could be more of an activist. And I know that I'm very privileged living in Europe, but sometimes it creates this increasingly sterile atmosphere in which there are prescribed ways of doing research, allowed things and not allowed. The university is completely neoliberal in the worst possible scenario. So, I mean, yeah, I totally agree with you. You're so right.
I think Professor Thakur wants to say in some
just a couple of sentences to make. Uncertainty principle actually led to understanding of what was happening factually. And that was the basis of quantum mechanics. So uncertainty does not relate to a stage where science gets abdicated. Secondly, even the chaos is an understanding of science which helps you to understand how a similar quote within quote situation with a slight difference can evolve into two or more separate things. So this is development for me, because if you take a Newtonian mechanics, then if you know all the momenta and the position coordinates, then you can predict everything. That was debated and that was found to be wanting. It is not that Newtonian mechanics was wrong, but it was limited in its approach to understanding of science. So you get to a better understanding by incorporating the uncertainty principle and the chaos principle, and also the general theory of relativity. I would stop here.
I will not reply to you because let it grow. But I'll just say one sentence. It is always better to include everybody possible. The inclusive process now we talk about in terms of understanding so-called Newtonian mechanics and so-called Einsteinian critique, whatever that is. So that would help probably scientists come down from their laboratories into the ground and tell that what is it and how do you explain the gender inequality in brain. All these things are necessary for the scientists to take up. That is my humble submission, which scientists haven't done much. They have to eat back their own cakes, polluted cakes, that we are not equal. Women and transgender are not equal. So I don't want to go there, but there is a colonization thesis there also. Anyway, anybody? Oh, I think Chandni Basu has a question. Madina, kindly look into the chat box. Chandni Basu has a question to you. How can
Let me see.
Yeah. How can you encourage students in class?
Encourage students in classrooms to think in terms of relational ontology. Well, I mean, there are ways. Like you can organize seminars in a certain way. Like yesterday, for instance, I had a seminar with our MA students. And I said to them, well, instead of discussing some literature that you read, which will be very passive and very kind of, okay, you know, transmitting facts or how you understood it, let's do an exercise. So I give them a situation, like imagine a situation of coloniality, of how can you remember a certain point that happened to you or you witness it that reflected how coloniality works, and write it down in through automatic writing, like we all write for 10 minutes, you know, whatever comes to your mind. It's very unrational, non-rational. So you don't rationalize, you don't build your sentences rationally, but you just put on paper whatever comes to your mind through that memory. And then we share it, we analyze it. You know, sometimes based on that, they prepare a theatrical performance, a short sketch, you know, that we can criticize. And I find it much more effective, because that way they have to be very critical of what they do and of their own experience, rather than, again, detaching themselves and just reading somebody's text and retelling it. That never works. That never creates relationality. And also it's very challenging because it was a new group of students, and so it's like 40 students coming from various European countries, from several African countries, from Middle East, some refugees, you know, some people of different races. And so when you put them in small groups, it takes a while to create trust in these groups, because if you're in a vulnerable position of being one black person in the group, you wouldn't like to share a lot of your experiences with whites, you know, because there's more of them and they're in their territory, so to say. So it's challenging, but I think that it works better, because in the end, it comes with more interesting results also. And sometimes what I do also in philosophical classes, I used to do it when I was in the belly of the beast teaching in one of the Russian universities many years ago. I was in the philosophical department. You can imagine what it was like. And I was the only woman there, and I was always teaching this long, long course in the history of philosophy. So in these courses, we read side by side the text by Western canon, philosophers from the Western canon, and some non-Western texts that I could find in translation. And that was the best exercise, because they could see how these, philosophies and how these points, the most important points, differed, and how there were some overlaps, but also some incommensurabilities and non-translatabilities, and some opacities that are also very important to understand the other, let's say. So I think that it is about inclusion of some forgotten and erased texts and names, but it's also about making students more active. And instead of them sitting and taking notes or taking pictures of your PowerPoint, you know, actually thinking, talking, acting, maybe sometimes going through some even stressful situations, but that's also very important in the process of education, no?
Can I ask everybody to show their face so that we can take a picture in the screenshot at least? Yes, everybody show their faces. Professor Thakur and Laura, you don't want to show your very beautiful faces?
Yeah, we are already in the screen.
You have already, no, still let me take. Professor
you see me?
Thakur, would you kindly show your face?
And myself, we are already in the screen.
You want to be same screen with Professor Dashgupta. Okay, good.
I'm in good company.
No. I have no objection in that. Whoever you want to be with screen is your discretion. Why should it be mine? So you don't want a single picture, fine. I don't mind. Rather, I don't care whether you have Madina or Guruship Dashgupta or Professor Alatas with your screen. Doesn't matter to me at all. We will be in disagreement, don't worry. So everybody, I thought that Medina did a wonderful job, really talking like almost, incessantly that we started questions. And again, Medina, thank you once again. And remember the request I made, preparing an article.
Okay, let me think about it.
You can only think, Varshad, but the answer has to be affirmative. I have given this
Okay.
duty also to Professor Alatas, and when Laura talks, Laura will also be told that. Everybody tells, and I give this gift in futuristic form. Please write an article so that it can come out, on India also, and so that, people in India, what my purpose is, before I die, that some people in India are thinking and working on decolonization and decolonial. That's all. I don't have much hope of a movement because I myself is not capable of physically doing that. Moiri, have you captured Moiri? Yes, have you captured all of us as much as possible?
আপনার ক্যামেরা একটু সোজা করবেন
আমার ক্যামেরা সোজা করব হাউ সোজা মানে কি রে
উপরে একটুখানি উপরে হ্যাঁ বাস
বাস ঠিক আছে হাসবো তাই তো আই শুড লাভ স্মাইল
ডান না
done good thank you
Okay,
everybody
thank you.
everybody and
Bula,
okay
Madina.
Madina
Thank you so much
we
for
have
coming and listening.
26 September at 6 p.m. Indian time. Torres, Nelson Maldonado Torres. Torres will be speaking from United States on decoloniality.
Good.
And it goes on, this lecture series goes on up to March, the first phase. After that, we want first volume, then second phase, second volume. This is the task I have been devoted to myself, nothing else, because I am 72. So better late than never. I had a fall yesterday from the bed, and you can see
Oh.
I was about to get I was about to lose my nose, I guess, and thank God it broke, but it has blood sucked in there. But that is why I am online. Otherwise, I would have gone to the university. That is the reason.
Yeah. I hope you get well soon. Take care of it.
Yeah. It is a bad one.
Take
Because
good care
I
of
fell
yourself.
down in sleep from the bed. So it was quite a bit of one, and my right hand is also very thank God, man, it's coming out from the atheist that thank God I'm not broken anything at this age.
Exactly.
Anything at this age will never actually recover. That's it.
No, please take good care of this.
Thank you everybody.
Thank you so much. Okay.
Madina.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Bula.
Professor
Thank you,
Alatas.
Madina. Thank you.
Thank you, Chandni.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Shanchari was there, I think, isn't it? Shanchari was there, isn't it? Okay, thank you. I don't know whether she's there. Thank you, Shanchari, Guruship Dasgupta, and whoever, Professor of Mathematics, Mriduladi was here. So please thank Mriduladi on my behalf. Okay.
Okay,
and
all right.
Special thanks to Professor Alatas, always.
No, not at all. Not at all. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you very
All
much.
right.
Okay,
good night.
bye. Bye.
Bye.
বাই ম্যাম
Bye.